In our last episode of the epic life of Napoleon, we witnessed a young general make a name for himself in Paris by shutting down a riot, then take a miserable and neglected French army to glory and victory in Italy. His success on the battlefield made him incredibly popular and famous, and the sensational reports and embellishing of facts didn't hurt either. When he returned from Italy, many expected him to take over France in a military coup, but he didn't. And not because he didn't want to. He definitely had a desire for supreme power at a young age, but he was smart enough to know that now was not quite the right time. He had a good sense for what people thought of him, and he knew he was popular, but not quite to the level where he could take over power and keep it for a long time. He didn't really have the political connections quite yet. So instead, he began to make preparations to do what the Directory wanted him to do, which was to invade England. Spoiler alert, he definitely did not invade England. At this point, Napoleon was practically playing the opposite game with whatever the Directory's orders were. They had almost no control over him because they were unpopular with the people, and if they disciplined him, they would become even more unpopular. Because Napoleon was popular. So his efforts to make himself look good to the people had paid off to the point where it essentially granted him more power. So he said, nah, I'm not invading England. I totally could if I wanted to, but our navy kinda sucks and the British are like the Chad of the ocean right now, so that's gonna be impossible. Napoleon was correct in this. It would have been incredibly risky to ship the French army over the English Channel, which was being patrolled by some of the most incredible ships and captains in the history of the Royal Navy. Like Horatio Nelson. We'll see more of Nelson later. For now, all you need to know is that Napoleon decided to invade Egypt instead. What? Why Egypt? Well, there's a good reason, like Napoleon thinking it's a cool, exotic location. Yeah, there wasn't really a good reason. The goal was to turn Egypt into a French colony so they could compete with the British, who were becoming a little bit too powerful for France's liking. And since they couldn't invade England, invading Egypt seemed like the next best thing. You have to understand that Napoleon was a huge nerd and thought it would be awesome to go to the land that his hero Alexander the Great conquered, and see the pyramids and stuff. So he strongly suggested to the Directory that they send him to Egypt. And they were like, honestly, the further away you are from Paris, the better. So yes, please go to Egypt, I'm sure you'll have a great time. And he did have a great time, but his army did not have a great time. Napoleon did a good job of planning certain aspects of the invasion, like packing his personal reading library, Burgundy wine, and bringing lots of scientists, historians, and artists. But he did a really bad job of planning small details, like canteens of water for his men in a desert invasion. That's right, his men had to march across a desert with no canteens of water. Tons of them died in the heat, and even more of them grew increasingly mutinous. Napoleon solved this problem like he solved all of his problems. By winning battles. But before the French had even fought a battle in Egypt, they almost didn't make it there at all. During their journey across the Mediterranean, Admiral Nelson caught wind of the invasion and sailed across the sea to intercept them. But the British Navy was so superior that Nelson actually passed them, beat them to Egypt, then assumed that Napoleon must have gone somewhere else and raced back to England. 2 days later, Napoleon arrived in Egypt. They quickly took Alexandria, then marched down to Cairo, where they prepared to fight a pretty epic battle with the pyramids in the background. Napoleon gave a cheesy speech about how they were under the gaze of centuries of history, but his men and generals were very much over Napoleon's historical fantasies, after facing the reality of marching across the desert in the summer with no water. They openly cursed at Napoleon, and some of them even committed suicide. Discipline had disintegrated when they were marching, and whenever they came across a village, they would take all their frustration out on the civilians. But when it came to the actual battles in the open field, the French army easily overpowered their main opposition, which was the Mamelukes, who had ruled Egypt since the 13th century. Napoleon employed square formations against the Mameluke cavalry and won the Battle of the Pyramids pretty easily. But the hardest part of turning Egypt into a French colony wasn't winning battles, it was keeping control of the population. Napoleon had the delusional fantasy in his head that the people there would welcome all the French innovation and enlightenment he was bringing. But the locals viewed it more like a foreign invasion, because that's what it was. However, to give him credit, he did bring some cool stuff to Egypt. He could set up the political administration of the cities he controlled however he wanted to, since there was no directory and no oversight in Egypt, and he thrived at that. As usual, he wanted his wife Josephine to come and join him while he was on campaign, and you might be surprised to hear based on how she's treated him so far in their marriage, but Josephine actually planned to do exactly that. She had finally come around to truly loving him despite his faults, and she was fully prepared to sail to Egypt. But she suffered a pretty bad injury in a freak accident where a balcony that she was standing on collapsed, so she wasn't able to visit him after all. It was probably for the best, because it was at this time that Napoleon discovered concrete evidence that she had cheated on him while he was in Italy, and he was furious. Later, he would take a lover in Egypt, which could be viewed as hypocritical or maybe what Josephine deserved. So instead of Josephine, Napoleon got a different visitor. Admiral Nelson was back, and when he discovered the French fleet at Aboukir Bay, he completely eviscerated it. Napoleon and his army were now stranded in Egypt with no ships. Realizing this would be a longer adventure than anticipated, he made the most of the situation, setting up a new political administration, creating hospitals, taxes, street lighting, and other public services. French soldiers also discovered the Rosetta Stone while they were there, which turned out to be one of the most important archaeological finds ever, because it allowed us to translate Egyptian hieroglyphs for the first time. It's now kept with all the other stolen artifacts at the British Museum, so that's pretty neat. Napoleon also began the production of gunpowder and cloth, which the army would need since the odds of getting supplies delivered from France were not good with Nelson patrolling the Mediterranean. This also meant that communication lines were disrupted between Napoleon and Paris, which was definitely a problem, but it was also kind of a blessing in disguise. Even though Napoleon was enjoying being in this exotic foreign land, with the destruction of the French fleet and a less than welcoming reception from the locals, and general discontent from his entire army and staff, this was not going well. But the people at home would have no way of knowing that. To make matters worse for Napoleon, new forces were gathering to oppose him. Waiting around wasn't really his style, so he decided to leave Marmont in Alexandria and quickly advance up the coast to attack Acre. This fast, aggressive movement is exactly what made him so successful in Italy. But here in Egypt, he was in for a bit of a wake-up call. Once again, he didn't bring enough supplies, and his men were sick, dying, and pretty pissed off. So when they came upon the small town of Jaffa, and their messenger bearing a white flag to the city was beheaded by its inhabitants, the army was not in a good mood. And that leads us to the most controversial and probably worst thing Napoleon ever did. After they took this town, his men went on a rampage of looting, rape, and murder on the town's mostly Christian population. Worse still, there were around 2,000 enemy soldiers that surrendered with the promise that their lives would be spared, but Napoleon instead had them all led out onto the beaches to be shot, bayoneted, and drowned. Not to justify these actions, but there is some added context that you should know. Many of these men had actually just been freed by Napoleon. Just a short time ago, he had let these prisoners of war free with the promise that they would not bear arms against France for 12 months. A kind of deal which seems ridiculous now, but was perhaps a little less strange back then. Those same men had then fought him here in Jaffa, which is why he was so enraged. What happened in Jaffa is considered a black mark on Napoleon's character, as it should be, but the fact that it didn't really hurt his reputation maybe shows how brutal of a time period this was. If anything, it made his men respect him more, and maybe fear him a little more too. A strange, terrifying new aura surrounded him, and to many of them it seemed like maybe he was becoming a little carried away by his sense of grandeur and fantasy of conquering a foreign land. His army moved on to Acre, and they began their siege. The first assault on the citadel failed, so 2 days later they tried again, and it also failed. So they tried again, and again, and again. Napoleon was nearly killed by an exploding shell in one of the attacks, but at this point he was determined to take Acre no matter what. He had never lost a battle and was not even really familiar with what losing felt like, so he tried again, and failed again. He didn't have any siege artillery, and this was getting ridiculous, so his generals finally persuaded him to give up and return to Cairo. So he sent a letter to the Directory saying he destroyed Acre, but obviously this letter was intercepted by the British, so it didn't really matter that it was completely made up. He told his troops, hey, we don't really even need to take Acre, guys. Trust me, there's way more important stuff we need to do, over here. We just have to march across the desert again. This whole campaign had been a massive disaster, but the amazing thing is, somehow with all the dying, angry men and pissed off generals, he still managed to maintain control over his army. He was sending reports to the Directory talking about how great everything was going. But back home, things were not going great. In Napoleon's absence, the French had lost almost everything they had won in Italy, and it was looking even worse on the Rhine. If something wasn't done quickly, the coalition rising against France would soon strangle it. Napoleon heard about these developments from reports that had gotten through to Egypt and decided he needed to get back home pronto or there wouldn't be a home to get back to. This meant abandoning his men and risking accusations of desertion, but it was a risk he'd have to take. He was also worried he might get captured by the British on the trip home. But his ship moved undetected across the Mediterranean back to France. What awaited him at home was astounding. The fame and popularity he had amassed winning battles in Italy was nothing compared to what he experienced now. As he traveled through France on his way back to Paris, he was greeted by enthusiastic, almost fanatical crowds. It seemed like every single person in the country wanted to catch a glimpse of the hero of Egypt, the conqueror of Italy, the savior of France. Napoleon's exploits in Egypt, dubious as they were, had only added to the public mythology and godlike status that he now experienced in France. The moment for him to seize power was finally here. But this wasn't going to be easy. In fact, it was one of the most stressful moments of his life. He'd have to be very careful. Yes, a military coup was always an option, but it wasn't one that Napoleon considered. He wanted to take over legally. Now, whatever manipulation and shady deals needed to happen was fine, as long as it had the appearance of a normal legal proceeding. Which, as you can imagine, was going to be challenging, since that legal proceeding needed to completely dissolve the current government. Napoleon had to balance two opposing political forces if he wanted to do this in the smoothest way possible. He had the royalists on the right, and the revolutionary Jacobins on the left. With all the turmoil in France and general discontent with the Directory, and the external threats they were facing, everyone knew that change was coming. It was just a matter of who would be in charge. What followed over the next couple months was a political web of alliances, backdoor deals, and a little backstabbing. One of the men who was planning his own coup was Sieyès, who actually had a decent amount of support. Napoleon and his entourage decided to team up with this guy, and they came up with a plan to replace the Directory with a council of three men: Sieyès, Napoleon, and Coup. To do this, they needed a large legislative body of 500 men to agree to it. But some of these men would definitely be opposed to it. So Napoleon's friends began the work of removing and/or silencing these dissenters. The whole thing could have easily ended in disaster or even death for Napoleon. The most tense moment came when the large legislative body met, and it finally became clear to everyone present who was behind this whole three-consul idea, and what was actually happening: a coup. Napoleon decided he would try to stand up and speak to them to persuade them that it was a good idea. But one thing I haven't mentioned that much is that Napoleon was not a very good public speaker. He was a military man. Direct, somewhat tactless, and he stammered over his words. Someone interrupted his pathetic speech with shouts of, "Down with the tyrant! Down with the dictator!" And chaos erupted in the building. Napoleon was mobbed, and it took several guards to escort him out before further damage was done. In typical Bonaparte fashion, he ended up using this incident as a news story about how the elders tried to assassinate him. It was a close call, and Napoleon was extremely tense during these couple days. He slept with a pair of loaded pistols next to his bed. But despite the outrage from some of the legislative members, they had in fact been outmaneuvered. Napoleon's friends had done their jobs, and enough support was there, and enough dissenters silenced, to dissolve the government, with the official reason being given because of the threats facing France, and the dire need for a dramatic solution. The man presiding over the legislative body that dissolved the government, his name was Bonaparte. Lucien Bonaparte, Napoleon's younger brother. Without him, it's likely this entire coup would have failed. But it succeeded, and Napoleon was now in a position to assume complete authority. But wait, aren't there three consuls? Well, come now, don't be so naive. Sieyès quickly realized who was really in charge here, and he and Ducos had to step aside as Napoleon took over as first consul. The first order of business was a new constitution, and there were tons of other things that needed to get done for Napoleon to shore up his position as the new leader of France. He surrounded himself with the best and brightest minds in the country, like his foreign minister, Talleyrand, his chief of police, Fouché, and countless other administrators, officers, and assistants. His administration was run like a military camp, and he drove his men in office just like he did in the field. They were forced to work relentlessly, day and night, giving Napoleon the detailed and frequent reports that he demanded. The result was spectacular, and a new France was taking shape. A new set of laws dubbed the Code de Napoleon was passed. Though he technically didn't write it, it definitely wouldn't have come about without him. And what's most impressive is that many of these laws and systems enacted by him are still in place today. So while his rise to power may have had a few speed bumps, the fact that he was essentially in charge of France at only 30 years old, well, it was nothing short of incredible. But as always, there were more threats on the horizon for Napoleon and France. Austria had taken back most of Italy and now threatened to invade France with a new coalition with Britain. Napoleon had to fight. That was obvious. But he was faced with a difficult choice now. Most country leaders no longer fought on the front lines with their armies like the kings of old. It was too risky and was left to the actual military experts. But Napoleon wasn't like the other leaders of the day. He was a military genius, and it would be a massive waste to keep the greatest military mind in human history stuffed up in the Tuileries. But if he did go out in the field and ended up getting killed in battle, France would be completely screwed since they had essentially just formed a new government around his leadership. I think you can probably guess what he did. Napoleon was marching across the Alps back into Italy. It's this setting that gives us the most famous painting of his life. He would be risking his life and the life of his country once again for glory on the battlefield. In the next episode of The Epic Life of Napoleon, we'll witness some of the greatest feats of battle in his entire career. You don't want to miss it.
Our eyes are closed when we start this loop on repeat. Hear my chest, how it beats when you put your hand